Hello, welcome to the Photo School. This video is part 3 of the basic photography tutorial and is about shutter speed. Shutter speed is the time the camera shutters open to let light hit the sensor in order to make an image. Shutter speed is one of the things you can use to control the exposure. The longer the shutter speed, the more light the camera sensor will capture. But keep in mind that camera shake can occur at lower shutter speeds. You can also look at part 1 of the basic photography tutorial about exposure, part 2 about aperture and part 4 about ISO values. If you think this video is worth your while, please give me a thumbs up, or rather subscribe to this YouTube channel. Use the comments below for questions and suggestions so I can make even better videos for you in the future.
The shutter speed is one of the three things that, together with the aperture and the ISO value, determine whether a photo is properly exposed. In addition to the amount of light, the aperture influences the depth of field. The ISO value determines the amount of digital noise. See part 2 and part 4 of this series of basic photography tutorial. In addition to the amount of light hitting the camera's sensor, shutter speed also affects whether a movement is frozen or not. In this graphic you can see how a slow shutter speed allows a lot of light to fall on the sensor, but also that at slower shutter speeds, motion blur is created, and at very short shutter speeds, fast movements can also be frozen and thus sharply captured in the photo. There are a few rules of thumb for the use of shutter speeds. The first is about the movement you make with the camera when you hold it with your hand. It is inevitable that you move slightly with the camera. That can cause motion blur, also called camera shake. There are lenses and cameras that can partially counteract this through image stabilization. Another solution is to use a tripod. This is especially true with fairly slow shutter speeds. If the shutter speed is fast enough, that motion blur will not be too bad. You can see whether the shutter speed is fast enough with the above calculation. The minimum required shutter speed depends on the focal length. There will be another video about focal length. The longer the focal length, the faster the shutter speed can be, and vice versa. The crop factor with a camera, with a smaller than full frame sensor, extends the focal length. That is why the crop factor is included in the calculation. Just look at the examples to see how that works. The second rule of thumb can be found here. If your subject is not moving, or if you want to blur that movement, such as with waterfalls, you can often use shutter speeds longer than 1/20th of a second using a tripod. With subjects with little movement, you can use relatively slow shutter speeds between 30th and 60th of a second, for example with landscapes and buildings. Shutter speeds between an 80th of a second and a 250th of a second can be used with subjects that move relatively slowly, including portraits and people. When there are faster movements, such as sports and vehicles, fast shutter speeds of 500th of a second or less are required. Of course, these are just rules of thumb. By practicing and looking at your own photos, you learn what works for your photos and what doesn't. So be sure to take a lot of photos. Here you see a photo that is unsharp, due to a slow shutter speed of 1/20th of a second, both due to the movement of the camera and the movement of the subject. With a 125th of a second, you can see that the same photo is sharp, because the slight movement is frozen due to the faster shutter speed. In the following photos you can clearly see the correct use of short and slow shutter speeds and the effect that has on the photo.
This is the end of part 3 in the basic photography tutorial. I hope you learned something about shutter speed. If you think this video is worth your while, please give me a thumbs up, or rather subscribe to the channel using the comments below for questions and suggestions so I can make even better videos for you. Bye bye.